Phillip. So in this video, we're going to talk about Henry James's novella, The Turn of the Screw. I would describe Turn of the Screw as an acquired taste that I have not yet acquired. I'd read this before sometime earlier in my life, and I didn't really care for it. The reason I've reread it now is that I am co-leading a study abroad trip, Literary London, where in summer of 2024 we will go to London. My colleague, who's teaching the other course, is teaching Turn of the Screw, and so I wanted to read all the stuff that she's reading for her course in addition to the stuff I'm reading for my course. This is a quintessentially English ghost story. It very famously helps set the pattern for what English ghost stories do going into the 20th century. Is also famously ambiguous. And that doesn't inherently bother me. That's not in itself a huge problem. But I don't know. I'm not a big fan of it. So there are things I like about Turn of the Screw, but then there's also things that I do wish were clearer. I guess that is part of what I don't like about Turn of the Screw, is there's so much that is unclear here. But I see why that's purposefully done. We are following a protagonist, a particular heroine. She becomes a governess to these two children. Basically, in London, their uncle, who is their guardian, places an advertisement for a governess to go out to his rural mansion in, I want to say, Sussex. She answers the advertisement, and she goes out and becomes governess to these two children. So basically, she is responsible for educating them and being a companion, protecting them, these kinds of things. In principle, she is the governess to Flora, the younger child, the younger sister. She's sort of incidentally governess for Miles, who's the older brother. Officially, he's supposed to go back to boarding school. They're 8 and 10. But the uncle in London gets a letter from the boarding school, which he doesn't read. He just sends on to our narrator, because the agreement of her hiring was that she will not bother him with anything. So he's basically like, here, whatever this is, you deal with it. Turns out Miles has been expelled from boarding school, no explanation given. Our narrator and Mrs. Gross, I think, Gross, G-R-O-S-E. Mrs. Gross, who's sort of the chief housekeeper, they become good friends. And what eventually starts happening is that the narrator starts experiencing these spectral presences, particularly, initially of a very sort of creepy, red-headed man, but then later of a woman in black. What they figure out from her description to Mrs. Gross is that these are the ghosts of Miss Jessel, and Peter Quint. Sorry, I couldn't remember their names off the top of my head. So Peter Quint had been the personal secretary, I think, to the uncle. He was kind of a villain. It's not 100% clear. There's a lot of late Victorian style implication, but it sounds like he was kind of sexing everybody. That he was more like he was a vile seducer, if you will. Miss Jessel was the former governess. She was also, like our narrator, young and attractive. And Peter Quint started an affair with her, ended up with both of them dying in circumstances not entirely clear. Our narrator becomes convinced that Miles and Flora know about the ghosts, or are in league with the ghosts, or are possessed by the ghosts, or something. It's not 100% clear, but there are various signs that Miles is being influenced by the ghost of Peter Quint, and Flora is being influenced by the ghost of Miss Jessel. The problem is that in the instances where later in the novella this is sort of directly addressed, there's no external confirmation of it. So there's one scene, for instance, where our narrator and Miss Gross have pursued Flora to the other side of this lake. Miles had taken the narrator and gone and just enchantingly played piano for her for like an hour or an afternoon or something like this. And Flora had just gone off on her own, which normally she never did. Normally the narrator tried to keep Flora with her at all times, particularly since she was terrified of Miss Jessel coming and like stealing Flora's soul or something, some undefined thing or ambiguous thing. So Flora has gone and gotten the boat, apparently, and 8-year-old child has loosed the boat, sailed it or rowed it across the lake, and then tied it up behind some bushes, which normally is not the kind of thing that an 8-year-old child is particularly capable of doing by themselves. So that's like kind of weird. Like maybe there's something else going on here. But then the narrator and Miss Gross walk around the lake to get to Flora on the other side because she's taken the only boat. And the narrator is like, fuck, Miss Jessel has appeared on the other side of the lake. She's so horrifying. And Miss Gross is like, yeah, man, I don't see anything over there. This is kind of freaking me out now. And the narrator's like, she's right there. Can't you see? It's a sort of, I don't know, Twilight Zone, maybe. Invasion of the Body Snatchers type moment where it's like, she's right there. Can't you see what's going on? And Miss Gross is like, I don't see anything there. I think you see something, but I don't see anything. And then Flora's finally like, I hate you. I don't want you anywhere near me because you're freaking me out. And so the narrator is convinced that this is the corrosive influence of Miss Jessel's ghost. But is it? And then Miles is very like weirdly sophisticated about his sort of denials about the whole thing, with the whole Peter Quint being there in spirit and whatnot element. And so Flora goes away with Miss Gross so that our narrator can confront the spirits of Peter Quint and Miss Jessel on her own, and she's going to try and sort of use Miles's loyalty to her against them in a plan that is not really spelled out. So things just get very, very ambiguous toward the end, and part of the problem with actually understanding what's going on in this novella is that because things are so ambiguous, we don't really know what's true and what's just in the narrator's mind. Like, is she just going nuts and sort of projecting this whole conspiracy of ghosts and whatnot into the world. It's possible there's some signs that seem to be externally confirming that what she's experiencing is real, but it's also worth noting that this is her manuscript. So anything that we would take as external confirmation is something that she herself has said. So that's further sort of trickiness here. Now, the other, and then at the end of the book, Miles just dies for reasons that are unclear. Like there's some sort of climactic battle for his soul, and it seems like he rejects Peter Quint and then dies, but it's a weird moment. Because what we get, so we get this thing, Flora and Mrs. Gross have already gone. So it's the narrator and Miles. Peter Quint has so they're together in a room. Peter Quint has appeared. She is trying to sort of stop him from seeing Peter Quint out of the sort of supposition that if she can prevent him from seeing Peter Quint, that will somehow aid her in her fight against these specters. So we start this section, the last portion of the novel. I'm going to read you the whole last portion of it. Is she here? Miles panted as he caught with his sealed eyes the direction of my words. Here is italicized, so clearly that's the word there's emphasis on. Then as his strange she staggered me, and with a gasp I echoed it. Miss Jessel, he with sudden fury gave me back. I seized, stupefied, his supposition. Some sequel to what we had done to Flora, but this made me only want to show him that it was better still than that. It's not Miss Jessel, but it's at the window, straight before us. It's there, the coward horror, there for the last time. At this, after a second in which his head made the movement of baffled dogs on a scent, and then gave a frantic little shake for air and light, he was at me in a white rage, bewildered, glaring vainly about the place and wholly missing, though it now, to my sense, filled the room like the taste of poison, the wide, overwhelming presence. It's he? That's Miles asking that. I was so determined to have all my proof that I flashed into ice to challenge him. Whom do you mean by he? Peter Quint, you devil, his face gave again round the room its convulsed supplication. Where? There are in my ears still his supreme surrender of the name and his tribute to my devotion. What does he matter now, my own? What will he ever matter? I have you. I launched at the beast, but he has lost you forever. Then, for the demonstration of my work, there, I said to Miles. But he had already jerked straight round, stared, glared again, and seen but the quiet day. With the stroke of the loss I was so proud of, he uttered the cry of a creature hurled over an abyss, and the grasp with which I recovered him might have been that of catching him in his fall. I caught him, yes, I held him. It may be imagined with what a passion. But at the end of a minute, I began to feel what it truly was that I held. We were alone with the quiet day, and his little heart, dispossessed, had stopped. What the fuck is happening here? Like, this is some insanely absurd ambiguity. Why has Miles died? What exactly has happened? Like, was he possessed by the ghost of Peter Quint? Was he possessed by the ghost of Miss Jessel? What's going on here? It's so unclear, and it just ends there. That's the end of it. It's just done. I kind of find it an infuriating ending. Particularly when you consider that the beginning of the novella is a frame story. We have the opening of frame story, and it never gets closed. It's a brilliant opening for a ghost story, because we're opening with this group of people who've gathered together apparently to tell ghost stories, and Douglas, who never appears after the frame story, is basically like, hey everybody, I've got this like really horrific kick-ass ghost story about two kids engaged with some ghosts, but I can't tell it to you right now. I've got to go send a dude back to my house to get the written manuscript, and then I'll tell it to you tomorrow. And so he builds this suspense both for the listeners but also for us as readers. And so we get this sort of setup where Douglas tells us that this is the manuscript written by the protagonist of the story, the narrator of the story, and that he has come into possession of it because she was also his governess. And so he had this connection with her, which sort of builds the authority of the story while at the same time creating a remove from it. So we have a further remove, even from, so James is the writer, James is the author, but it is in first person narration, which means we have one remove initially. So James is not the speaker of the story, even though he is the author. But here we have a further remove because what we're getting is the manuscript being read by Douglas. So we have a speaker who is not James. And then that speaker is at a remove from the author of the manuscript itself. So we've got this distance created, which I think is really, really interesting. But then it just disappears. The frame story is never closed. Again, I get why a lot of the ambiguities here, particularly about whether or not what our narrator is seeing is true. I get why those things are interesting and important for a ghost story, but it irritates me.